So yeah, just to summarize a bit of what we're talking about today, Gen Z are of course a very coveted section of the workforce in the tech talent market, but they are also wanting to write a new script for the way they work, prioritizing flexibility, remote collaboration, and a transparent culture of communication as well. So this Sifted Talk is going to delve into strategies for understanding, engaging, and empowering this new generation of workers to fuel the next growth phase for your business. We'll be discussing new ways of working, what tools and apps do Gen Z love and hate to use, setting the right foundations, that's across culture, and how to establish a connected workplace across geographically spread and sometimes remote teams. And we'll also hopefully touch on AI and how the latest technology that so many are trying to adopt in their companies, how we can make that accessible and empowering to Gen Z as well. So I'll do quick introductions of our panelists. To start off, we've got Robbie O'Connor, GM of EMEA at Notion. Previously was also heading up EMEA sales at Asana and Dropbox. We've got Paula Garcia Domingo, partner at Index Ventures, previous experience at Snap and Deliveroo. Siobhan O'Reilly, VP of Sales EMEA at Figma, previously a country manager at Dropbox. And Ashley Firth, Global Director of Engineering at Octopus, and he was one of its very first employees and has been part of its growth from a small startup to an $8 billion valued company in just 8 years. So a really exciting panel of people with different types of experience, and yeah, I'm excited to get into it. So let's dive in. And just one note for the audience, we do have a Q&A function. So if you want to kind of say or ask anything specific to try and tap into the expertise of these brilliant speakers we've got, do just put your questions in the Q&A box and I'll try and drop them in as and when we go to fit in naturally with the discussion. So without further ado, Robbie, I'm going to start with you. Before we get into sort of the details and the nitty gritty, I want you to set the scene if possible about why this is such an important topic for companies. And ahead of this panel, you made a great point about how a poor tech experience can really hurt hiring for companies, particularly when it comes to Gen Z applicants. So tell us about that.
Thanks, Tim. Obviously a topic that's really, really close to my heart, and one we get a good degree of proximity to, with Notion, with our user base and our customer base. When we were doing a little bit of research last year, as we do some planning, we observed that Gen Z and millennials currently make up approximately 38% of the global workforce, with this percentage going to rise to about 58% by about 2030. That's that we discovered from Forbes. Obviously, Gen Z are, as you call it, are digital natives. They expect hybrid work. They value clearly establishing work-life balance, and they have an increased emphasis on things like mental health, which is new to many organizations, and it's a new thing that this generation is bringing to the workforce. In turn, as well, you see that Gen Z, they want tools that are intuitive, that are flexible, and that are integrated, and ultimately make them more productive and more aligned. And we find that these workers are more in sync and more understanding of these different benefits than previous generations before. It's really important, I think, for organizations to be well aware of this, because investing in your environment to make Gen Z really functional within the workplace is going to be not just about setting up efficiencies or cutting costs, but by creating a strong culture and a strong value set to ensure there's trust and transparency within the organization. As you mentioned, we observed as well in a study we ran last year that in France, a study by recruitment platforms showed that 70% of 18 to 25-year-olds in France abandoned their application in the middle of the recruitment process due to cumbersome applications and tools, leading to long lead times and a lack of clarity. So it's just one small example of why companies really investing in having the right approach here can have a competitive edge.
Yeah, I think it's a really striking stat. And also, in a way, I'm also surprised that 38% of the workforce is Gen Z, but maybe I shouldn't be. But anyway, it really does show the importance of this discussion. So moving on to you, Paula. So you're on the border between millennial and Gen Z. So you're sort of the closest thing we've got to lived experience in this otherwise gaggle of millennials, I think. But tell us about some of the sort of key differences you see between yourself and older generations at work. Like if you could, I guess, summarize how you see younger people coming to the workplace and how they're bringing fresh ideas.
Yes, of course. I think the first thing where I notice a difference is being comfortable collaborating with teams that are remote, and leveraging tools that allow for asynchronous communication. At Snapchat, I was able to work with the San Francisco team, having never met them in person, but leveraging tools like Slack, Google Sheets that enabled collaboration. And I think because we're so comfortable using these tools, it actually enables for like cross time zone collaboration. So at times, sometimes when we needed to roll out a project within a week, we had 24 hours a person working on it, because I would log off, would hand it over to my colleague in San Francisco, and there was this continuous person working on a single project. And so I think it's super exciting because we lean into these tools so much, we can unlock next levels of productivity. And I think the other thing is a sense of urgency. I think this culture of immediacy, constant communication, constant notifications. I think Gen Z approaches work with a lot of enthusiasm, with a lot of energy. But on the flip side, I think a culture of immediacy can, when taken to the extremes, can also be a disruptor and an interrupter to set momentum. And I think where tools are actually really effective is in setting the right boundaries when said momentum is being interrupted. So what I mean by this is, if you're having a super exciting remote conversation, but with colleagues over video conference, and then you're being interrupted by a Slack message, well, that takes your attention away from the conversation that you're having. But I think where tools come in said situations is that I think pausing notifications, being able to connect your Slack to your Google Calendar and actually highlighting that you're on focus time, or also just switching off the laptop and when you're in person, listening to your peers. So I think on one hand, it's super exciting because I think we're flexible. We can work remotely. We engage with asynchronous communication, but simultaneously we should be leveraging these features in products that basically protect us from the negative side of said behaviors.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I very much relate to the whole Slack experience. I find it to be actually quite damaging to my productivity. I could probably do with a Gen Z consultant to help me set up my notifications in a slightly more mindful way. Anyway, Siobhan, I want to come on to you. I think what's interesting about what Paula just said is that she's kind of painted a picture of a very kind of motivated, very engaged, very immediate, as she said, workforce. And I think there is perhaps a bit of a lazy stereotype, which I feel is kind of inherited across generations. When we millennials joined the workforce, we were called snowflakes who, couldn't deal with tough messaging, didn't want to work hard. And I think there is a bit of that going around about Gen Z, that they don't necessarily want to, put in the hours. They think that they're entitled to much sort of clearer boundaries than anyone else has ever expected. Tell me how you've experienced in terms of welcoming the next generation into your office at Figma.
Yeah, I love this as a topic in general because there are differences. And to Paula's point as well, a lot of that does come from communication style. But if you think of the world that, some of us millennials entered in the workspace, it's very different. It's shifted a lot and you mightn't think it. But thinking back to my first job, the way collaborative work was done was in a meeting room together, and everything else outside, everything at your desk was very siloed, and that's changed so dramatically in the last even 10, 12 years. And so for this generation of workers entering the workspace, they haven't had necessarily that experience, and we've had the COVID in the middle of that's changed that model entirely. And so we go from that to today's world, where it was very much a 9 to 5. And, I confess I was one of those managers who, if you weren't at your desk at 9 o'clock, it's like, what's going on? Which is embarrassing now to think about almost. It's very different now, where we have so much flexibility and we look way more at outputs rather than kind of time spent at work. But yeah, it definitely causes some challenges. So, we have, from how I think about it with our workforce currently, it's trying to be mindful of meeting people where they're at. What I might be used to is resolving topics over conversations, either on Zoom or teams or meeting rooms, whereas I do notice a lot of this new workforce is very used to asynchronous communication. So solving questions on Slack or Teams, or even in collaborative tools like comment sections on Notion or Figma. And that's different, but it poses the challenges that Paula brought up, right? Where you have, when do you stop? When are you off? And that's really difficult. And to me, there's, the functionality of the tool, but it's also a responsibility of the leaders in the organization to kind of set expectations there. So, for example, there's nothing more frustrating when you're on a meeting, on a Zoom call with someone, and you can clearly see that they're responding to a Slack message. So there's habits there to build in. How do you make sure you're switching off your Slack when you're online and having a one-to-one with somebody? Or if you're happen to be doing some work that's in the evening or maybe over the weekend, how are you scheduling your communication that's being delivered out to employees? So again, you're not setting the expectation that you need to be on all the time, or even setting expectations on when you expect a response on something. So there's a lot that has changed in that time period.
For sure. And I think that's a really interesting point as well, that the way that these tools can intrude into our balance isn't necessarily just work and personal life, but different kinds of work. And sometimes they can take our kind of presence and mind away from what we're actually meant to be doing. So definitely super important to have a good strategy with that. Ashley, I want to ask about, we've talked quite a bit about how things have changed in terms of, remote, hybrid, asynchronous communication. And, I guess, as someone who's obviously risen up the ranks in quite a dramatic way at a company like Octopus, which has scaled a lot, I want to ask you about the balance that Gen Z and those above them in the kind of company hierarchy should encourage, in terms of how can companies try and make sure that Gen Z workers, if they are remote, hybrid, geographically spread out, how can they get that experience that you just get from that office environment, which I'm sure you got in spades at Octopus in the early days, of just learning from people with experience and kind of, I guess, also learning the soft skills of what it's like to work, I suppose. How have you seen that change in recent years?
Yeah, sure thing. Hello, everyone. Yeah, it's a tricky one, right? I think what Siobhan was saying earlier is quite important, is that the Gen Z set new rules for all of us, realistically, right? We came into the workplace and there were certain ways of operating in this, and I think this new generation has been quite clear about what they want from their work and how they'll get their kind of best work done from that side of things. And I think it shook things up in a really positive way, right? I think we benefited from the fact that we're quite a young company, right? There aren't too many established processes in that side of things, and we've always been a big fan of wherever those people are. If you want to get the best talent, that is where you go and find them, right? Like, and having the tools that will enable you to do what Paula was mentioning and kind of hand off pretty seamlessly and work with people regardless of where they are, I think kind of opened up a fairly kind of drastic untapped vein of talent that maybe otherwise would have kind of maybe not considered joining us or another company, or not considered relocating in that side of things. So I think if you think about it more as an opportunity to get these incredible people from wherever they are around the world, rather than it being this kind of barrier to overcome or this thing to convince, it becomes a bit like you were saying, Tim, and something more about how do you create the best working environment where people aren't necessarily in the same place together. And I think the tools do an incredible job of doing those sorts of things. We're proud users of all of the tools that have kind of represented in this webinar, and they help an awful lot from that side of things. But I think importantly, having the boundaries to say when you are involved in that is kind of your direct communication time and not your asynchronous communication time, right? As Siobhan was saying, you don't want to see people typing when you're doing something. You want to be fully engaged, blocking out that part of time. And I think the main thing that we do to kind of live that in the work that we do is kind of freedom and responsibility, right? We don't mind when those talks are taking place, but that everyone is completely present when they are, right? So making it something about, Greg's always kind of described it, our CEO, is like you're building a kind of dry stone wall, right? Every kind of brick is slightly differently shaped, but together it forms something incredibly strong. So if you can kind of bring together the working conditions of everyone and kind of meet them using these tools in the places that make most sense, and doing that best work together, and being conscious of being there and being present for each other when they're doing that work, which I think people typically are, that is when you get the best out of everyone that's involved, and you get the best work as a result of it.
Yeah, and I'm going to put this out generally if anyone's got an answer to this one. But in terms of, I definitely see what you're saying in terms of making sure people are present for those sort of, dedicated communication times. But in terms of those more like serendipitous moments, maybe like the office cooler chat, I know that one thing we've introduced here recently, actually, at Sifted is it's quite simple. It's this Slack app called Donuts. I don't know why it's called Donut, but the idea is that you just randomly get paired with someone else in the company once a month and you just organize time for a chat. And it's just been a way for us to kind of get to know each other better, and you learn about different parts of the business that might be a bit more siloed than is ideal, that kind of thing. So I just wonder if anyone's got any interesting kind of, experience they've had of just little tips or tricks that have, yeah, I guess like enabled some of that more, I guess, natural and slightly less in the professional box communication that can be so important to people's growth at companies.
Yeah, I might hop on immediately. That's like we use Donut as well. We think it's really, really cool, being able to, particularly for new starters as well, right? If any company is growing at speed, you can kind of throw as much as you can into the onboarding side of things and point people in the direction of things that are there. But nothing quite replaces that serendipitous chat, that kind of sit down with someone who's in another part of the business that you maybe wouldn't naturally kind of come across. Like you say, you might pass them in the hallways, but now you pass them virtually in a meeting room in something like that. And so we kind of put a large emphasis on, look, there's a big company. The other little things that we do are we have what's called family dinner. Every Friday we sit down and we talk pretty honestly about what's gone well, what's not gone so well, and kind of give people more of an insight into what else is going on there, and trying to encourage more of those thought pieces around, okay, well, I'm probably doing something maybe a little adjacent there. Maybe I'll go and have a conversation, or let me just sign up for a range of different donuts, because you can have general ones where you meet everybody in the business, but you can also have one specific to maybe the type of work you do, or specific to another country or discipline, and that helps an awful lot from that part. So I think encouraging that and saying, that is not a waste of time as far as the company sees it, right? Like it's, you don't want to spend all your time in meetings, of course, but I think it is important for you to equally, as you're blocking out time for yourself to get your own work done, to go and meet other parts of the business, because you would do it organically anyway. You shouldn't feel like you're stealing time, or you're not, spending time on the important things, because you never know what sort of communication there is going to spark the next big thing that'll help the business. So I think it takes both sides to commit to it to match what you might have had in the office, I think.
Yeah, nice answer.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, Paula, sorry. I've only got two of you up in my top thing.
Go ahead, Siobhan.
Sure, I can jump in. Yeah, just to add to that, I agree with those. Also plug for Donut, we use it too. But another thing that I think has risen, I guess, in the last few years as well, is the importance of ERGs, or employee resource groups internally. Having this shared workspace where it's more dependent on either identity or interests or communities. They've really taken foothold, I think, in the last few years, and are lovely examples of where all sorts of cross-functional stakeholders come together regardless of department or seniority. So yeah, another one I'd certainly advocate for.
Yeah, nice. Paula, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to share something that we did specifically at Snapchat, which is called Council. It's basically like circle time, an opportunity to share anecdotes and listen to your colleagues, usually facilitated by a council psychologist. And I joined Snapchat completely remotely. I interviewed, didn't meet any of the people in person, and worked probably for the first 4 months completely remote with the team. And council was such an effective way of I think specifically when you're working remotely, you don't really get time for those funny anecdotes, conversations that make you closer to your colleagues, and ultimately provide the psychological safety to then actually have really tough conversations. Or, I think you're more productive when you trust the people that you're surrounded with. And so, one thing that we do in council is that you usually have it before an offsite. So for example, if it's the kickoff for 2024, it's usually about share a story about new beginnings, or if it's a closing of the year, then it's usually what's the best gift you've ever received, or what's a Christmas tradition from where you're from. And I found it's such an effective way of getting to know your colleagues outside of work, and then building trusting relationships.
Yeah, I think that's a great and important point to make, actually, about that psychological safety. And I think it's something that a lot of people from perhaps like the millennial generation perhaps take for granted, that we entered the world of work when the office was the norm de facto, and a lot of Gen Z, their first job will have been taken under lockdown conditions, very stressful in and of themselves when it comes to psychological safety. But yeah, also just a completely different paradigm in terms of how we all communicate and get to know each other. Robbie, I'll come back to you. At Notion, how have you tried to kind of bring that sort of that bonding and psychological safety to make the team feel like everyone can support each other?
So I love the points that the rest of the panelists made, and we follow many of them, from clever usage of Donut and an open strategy towards Slack channels, everything to E or G endorsement and whatnot. What I kind of observed over the last little while as well is that companies need to be more clued in to understanding the zeitgeist of their organization, and to be mindful to start treating their culture almost in a way that they treat a product, understanding it deeply, testing it, monitoring it. I think we've all done many engagement surveys as well, and then being open to adapt it depending on what needs kind of arise as well. Companies go from small to medium to large. Ashley, you would have experienced that, I think, in Octopus over the last little while. And, you know, the way that people communicate with each other and the way that they understand information from top down or bottoms up or in the middle kind of changes, and it's quite varied as well. So I think leadership within the organization having a really strong approach to being quite in tune with their culture and their communication standards is really important. I know within Notion, within our group here in Dublin and Ireland, we even have like a WhatsApp channel that allows a different level of dissemination of information and even a bit of satire. You know, you have people who are kind of making a little bit of light of some of the decisions that we make, which are kind of fun, all the way through to different types of channels within Slack, where people can connect based on activities that they enjoy, through to more formal pieces like ERGs as well. And I think we're quite mindful just to adapt our communication strategy and standard all the time to make sure that we're able to touch as many people as we can, and that they feel very welcome and included.
Yeah, nice answer. Okay, I'm going to bring in an audience question now, just so we keep those threaded in through the conversation. This one's from Martin van der Belt. And Martin asked, what about working during the weekend? Is that being frowned upon since people need off time? And I think, you know, in this context, it's a really interesting one. You hear a lot about early stage startups, and particularly the founders kind of, you know, often working all hours to try and make their amazing idea happen. And we see it in the companies we cover at Sifted, that, you know, there's that kind of truism, which might be a stereotype, but I do think is true, that culture often comes from the top, and often founders are having to check their sort of, you know, drive and every hour of the day motivation to stop their employees getting burnt out. So perhaps I will, maybe Paula, I'll come to you, just as you're someone who kind of has visibility across a lot of different companies. How do you guys approach that sort of, you know, work-life balance, both at Index but in the portfolio companies you see? And if any of the other panel would like to chip in on this after Paula, please do.
I think there are moments where you may have to work outside of the given hours, but I think just zooming out, I think it's always a question about what's the priority and what's the output and what impact is that going to have. So I think just always being mindful of what are we trying to achieve, and am I working because I'm trying to send a signal that I'm working hard, or I'm working hard because there's a clear North Star that I'm trying to follow, and we're building something incredibly exciting. And in order to capture that opportunity and capitalize on that opportunity, we need to move fast. But I always think that, and here's where I think managers play a big role, and need to be careful with, because Gen Z has this sense of urgency and immediacy. I think I see this in myself. I'll treat a Slack with the same importance as a project that I need to deliver in the next 24 hours. And so I think that's where managers can play a huge role in communicating what level of priority this has, or leveraging tools like Notion and aligning everyone on, is this high, medium, low priority? So I think, leveraging the tools to communicate the degree of priority and importance, and seeing how that contributes to the bigger goal.
Yeah, nice answer. we've got another question sort of that follows from this. So were you going to speak, Siobhan?
No, that's great. I'll let you go to the next section.
Well, maybe I'll put this one to you, actually. So this is from Felix Mellon. Kind of follows on in terms of Felix says he's very supportive of the stance the panel is taking and offering sort of sympathetic strategies for employee attraction, management, engagement. Everyone seems agreed on that. How do we feel about this sort of perhaps backlash to this kind of remote work paradigm, led by, as Felix points out, Elon Musk, in terms of wanting to kind of get everyone back in the office 5 days a week, you know, hardcore workers, I think he described it, quite a sort of skeptic of DEI. And I get the sense that this is not the perspective that our panel holds, but I think it is interesting that perhaps there is a kind of backlash to, you could even describe it as a kind of woke informed office place. Like, are you guys starting to see that across, you know, the industry? There are quite a lot of Elon Musk fans out there.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, this one. And there's probably no real right answer per se. You know, so many companies have taken different approaches to this, whether it's going fully remote or some kind of hybrid version in between, which seems quite common. Or yeah, you have the other end of the spectrum entirely, which is Elon Musk certainly advocates for. I think at Figma our approach is hybrid. But that even differs across regions. So for EMEA, what was interesting is we set up our EMEA offices actually just during COVID unintentionally. It just happened that way. But the kind of position we found ourselves in now is very much encouraging a hybrid attitude to work. So in London, for example, we have people who come in Tuesday and Thursdays typically into the office. And everything outside of that is flexible. People tend to work from home Monday, Wednesday, Fridays. We've never been in a position where we have had to enforce that. So it's a guideline, but people tend to like that type of balance. So I guess my personal view on this is that it's always an ideal state where you can arrive at a point where people feel empowered to do their best work and you're not having to dictate you need to be absolutely at your desk or this particular space to do your best work. So yeah, that's kind of how I would think about it, is how are you enabling people to do their best work? And ideally not having to put stringent guidelines in place around that is probably the preferred state.
Yeah, nice. We've spoken a lot about, or touched on kind of the sort of the way you can set up your suite of tools to cater best to this next generation. Actually, I wanted to come to you on this before the call. You discussed how like one of the sort of aspects of tooling and software that Gen Z like is kind of flexibility and freshness. Tell us about how you've experienced that with your younger workforce.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just as a very quick note to the thing that Paula was mentioning, which I think she was totally correct about I guess managers modeling how they communicate with people. We find, because we're in so many different spots and inspiration strikes at different times, people are jumping immediately to the tools and posting something, and I think it's on the managers to mention that this isn't something that has to be actioned immediately, right? I think there's nothing worse for someone if your manager or your manager's manager appears in your Slack on a Sunday, you take it as gospel, right? Like, I've got to do something about this. I've got to tap onto it. So a reminder of like scheduling those things to maybe arrive a little bit later, as you can do in Slack and things like that, or saying this isn't one for now, but it's something to consider anyway. So just wanted to touch into that. But yes, the idea of tools, I mean, we've not had to shift between too many different ones, but the ones that we have, we're incredibly happy with and have adopted entirely. But I think there is an aspect of, you know, this being the first generation that were born to do this from the start, right? Digitally native, and haven't had to kind of do much upskilling for those particular things. And one thing we found certainly in the world of tech is that it's always changing, right? There's always a new interface or a new cool approach to something or a new feature. And so for us, it's been very important that the tools offer change in a couple of ways, right? There are those, what we call conventional change, you know, all of those new features when you spring open a tool and it says you can now do this, or we've connected with this. That's fantastic. That makes it feel fresh. But then the kind of change that you can do yourself, right? Having something that is constantly feeling as though you're moving towards mastery with it, that you can kind of peel back another layer and you can take more advantage of it. I'm a big fan of what Notion offers in terms of being able to build your own templates, right? And Figma can kind of separate your side hustle stuff from your main work stuff, and in that side of things. And I think offering that ability to say, I can do with this tool whatever I want. It's going to keep offering me different things, but I can also make use of it in brand new and inventive ways, makes it feel less stagnant over a period of time, and makes it feel less like you might have to consider a new approach every couple of years if the companies themselves are innovating with it and the people that you have using it are innovating with it as well. I think that creates a lot more engagement in tools than we've typically seen in the older ones before. So those are the main ways that I've seen it kind of use change for its kind of betterment.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, we've got a lot of audience questions coming in, so I'll try and come back to them as we go. I wanted to actually just come on back to you, Siobhan, for this, because I was someone who grew up in a world of basically using Adobe, doing a lot of kind of podcast, audio, video editing, that kind of stuff. And what Ashley just described about peeling back the layers is something that really resonates, but I felt like often with Adobe, it almost felt like sort of hammering it away at them with a sort of a sledgehammer, because it was so sort of impenetrable. And I think, tools like Figma and also Notion have become really popular for their ease of use, but also, as Ashley said, their flexibility and sort of depth of features. And I know that, that is something that Gen Z really appreciates. And I wanted to ask you how Gen Z adoption of things like Figma has kind of actually been almost part of your marketing strategy. I know you spoke about ambassadors and having Gen Z ambassadors. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So firstly, at Figma, we have a wonderful community of users. The product started from this concept of growth among this user base, and something we talk a lot about internally is our community. And a lot of that is kind of driven by, I suppose, how, again, the world has shifted, in terms of go-to-market in this day and age. A lot of that is driven by PLG, product-led growth, and we certainly kind of fall in that bucket. And something actually interesting that was flagged to me only recently is that Gartner did a study that referenced apparently 80% of workers are dissatisfied with the tools their IT departments provide them. And I think we really see Gen Z as change champions that, will push and accelerate for adopting tools and processes that they prefer and allow them to work at their best. And we've had instances even at Figma where we might have someone call up and, be looking to kind of onboard on the platform because they've lost a candidate in recruitment that, to Robbie's earlier point, just said, you know what, you're not providing the tool that's my preferred choice. So this isn't going to enable my best work, therefore I'm out. To the extent that, that's something we think about actively when we think about our value proposition and how we think about our customers. So yeah, it's a very, very interesting topic, is this concept of trying to make sure that workers are using tools that they're satisfied. 80% dissatisfaction is a massive number. But if you think about it also, it's kind of not surprising. We've entered into this space where, you think about back in, say, 2010, back in the era of when the first iPhones came out, it was about 140,000 apps in the Apple Store. Now there's something like 1.8 million, and that's just looking at Apple, never mind Android. That's like a 13% increase in 12 years. And so it means that only well-designed websites and apps have a chance to succeed. So you really have to think about the importance of, digital design and how you're positioning yourself in that type of market. So it kind of goes without saying, really, that this concept of people being able to use their preferred and best tools is kind of an organic transition that we're witnessing.
Yeah, really interesting how that becomes part of the product-led growth. We're going to go back to audience questions here. I'm going to throw this one your way, Robbie. So this is from Amber. So she asks, is there any suggestions for small startup teams of under 6 people of how to maintain work-life balance connections between co-workers, suggesting that, in big techs or bigger companies, you can have these kind of groups within groups. But how would you say this can work in teams of smaller people in terms of trying to foster these relationships when it's, I guess, that slightly more intense environment? There's perhaps not so much choice of, who your co-workers or your friends might be in that environment. And yeah, I'll come to you, Robbie, first, and maybe Paula, as someone who sees a lot of these early stage startups, you could chip in afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've never worked for a company of that size formally. I've worked for a couple of my brothers' own little projects from time to time, but I wouldn't have experience per se. But I have observed a lot of these smaller companies, and you know, in Notion, we're not even that far away from being a 6-person company ourselves. We're still pretty young in our journey as well. What I kind of observed is that the culture when you're 6 people is really important, and it's very different to when you're 20 people, to when you're 100 people, to when you're 500 people and 1,000 people. And I guess when you have a small team like that you're hiring, you're quite picky about who you're bringing on board. You're looking for a certain set of values, a certain sort of traits in people who you come in, and those small teams typically bond quite well. You'll observe this in bigger organizations as well, where you have teams of 6 or you have smaller teams, and there can be this very special bond that happens between colleagues and teammates there. Obviously, in a small organization, I can imagine things are a bit more ramped up because you're very dependent on each other. You're all focused on mission criticality, and that's why I think it's really important for leaders within that group. As we were talking about earlier on, the concept of boundaries, in an always on environment and an always kind of in each other's face environment, I think leaders can work quite hard to ensure that there's very clear boundaries that are set there, that you're quite clear on expectations, when things can be delivered, and how. Quite clear on deadlines, and quite clear on how we interact with each other. But I always think that smaller period of time, certainly in Notion, sound like a very special time. We still have a handful of our first 6 who are still within our organization a number of years later, and they speak very fondly about the ability to move fast, to be agile, that big decisions, you know, potentially company critical decisions can be made really fast and can be executed on quite well.
Nice. And Paula, what about you in terms of, that trying to foster that safe culture within small teams? Because we do hear the odd horror story about how these kind of very personality-led small startups can be extremely challenging places to work, particularly if you don't have loads of experience and that kind of confidence to stand your ground and set your boundaries.
Yeah, I think a 6-people team, that's I think what I would a way to maintain momentum while still not burning everyone out, I think, is celebrating the wins. I think when you're moving 1,000 miles an hour, sometimes it's worth just stopping and seeing, okay, what have we achieved, and celebrating each of the 6 individuals for what they've contributed. I think sometimes when you're trying to achieve so much with so little, you're being so resourceful, and you can get lost in the excitement. And I think just taking that step back and acknowledging what each person is contributing is super important. And then I think as a leader in that organization, small organization, I think one thing that Gen Z really appreciates is feeling seen for their strengths, but also their weaknesses, and how you can assign projects that provide personal development. So I think thinking about how you can really empower each of those individuals, and always communicating, right? I'm giving this to you because I think you're fantastic at this, and this person actually wants to practice this more, so let's give it to that person. So I think those would be ways that I would maintain the work-life balance, and yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a great answer. I'm going to go to another audience question, just because we've got some really good stuff, and I want to make sure people can get the most out of this session in the audience. So this is from Joanna Hooper. I think this is a really interesting one. She describes an air gap between school university output and leadership tone and styles in organizations. So she's saying that the former is typified by expecting a sort of coaching approach. I think we're talking about school and university there, where the latter is typified by more command and control. So she obviously sort of acknowledges those are sweeping statements. But as we do move from that kind of environment where we are kind of guided and kind of perhaps a bit more spoon-fed, and perhaps, you know, more traditional workplaces, it's then do this, do that. How do we close that gap? I'll come to you, Ashley, as someone who's, you know, taken on management responsibilities as you've grown at Octopus.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We've seen it a lot because we work with a lot of universities, and they join straight out of university maybe don't have any industry experience, and as you said, they're used to a particular way of organizing. I would kind of flip the question on its head a little bit as well, because you do have a coaching aspect to it, but in maybe school, university, you're being kind of led down a very particular curriculum. You're being said, you need to learn these things, operate in this way, and do this stuff. And then you suddenly reach the world of work, where certainly at the speed that we do certain things, maybe it's less clear. Some of the answers may not be immediately obvious. There may be multiple ones, and you may be asked to face a problem instead of a task or something like that. And I think that's the type of work that actually really excites people. And I think there has to be some difference between what I've been told I need to learn to reach this qualification, and then what I can do to embody all of those skills that I've picked up from university and then push forward to learn some more. So I think the way that we typically tackle it is, if the management style can kind of meet in the middle a little bit, whereby anybody that joins, particularly those that are fairly new to the industry, we take them on a kind of coaching plan, right? We say, these are the resources that you have available to you, much like university. We're not going to sit over your shoulder and say, you should learn this, this, and this, but they're available to you. They're free. They're ready to go. Here is around the work that you're doing, what you can learn to kind of help bolster your productivity, but also help you grow inside the kind of organization. And that gives you the freedom to say, I'm going to do it when I want to, the responsibility to say, this will help me move in the kind of right direction there, but not impose on them anything that actually feels all that different from university. You get out of it what you put into it from that time and that effort, realistically. And I think you give that, and you start to maybe not say, hey, welcome to the company, here's 20 tickets, and your reward when you're done is 20 more tickets. That's not going to inspire anybody, right? We like to put people into slightly deeper water, but in a way that kind of mirrors the way of, I'm going to go and explore this topic and see what's there. I know I've got a support network if I need it, but by and large, this will be my thing to pick up and own. And I think that starts a really important trend that can kind of allow people to keep growing and keep being excited by what they do in their work. So I guess the answer to Joanna's really good question is to mirror a bit of what university operates, but maybe allow the subject matter to be a little bit more open-ended and free-flowing, and let those people use their skills to take it in the direction that they want, rather than saying this is the curriculum or the path for everyone.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of people remember how that can be very refreshing when you leave education, that you can be hopefully a bit more entrepreneurial and a bit less kind of strictly guided by the learning material for you. We are sort of coming into the back end of this. I want to move on to AI, because it's obviously such a big topic that many people are interested by at the moment, if we're not all sick and tired of talking about it. But I think it's a really interesting one in the context of this discussion, just because there's obviously a lot of anxiety about AI and work and how it could be taking work. We've already seen big companies like IBM make cost savings because they think they can make more efficiencies with AI now. And I also think a lot of people recognize, wrongly or rightly, that it will be the lower end of work perhaps that is the most affected first. And you might have someone with experience and strategy who is overseeing an AI system rather than a team of juniors. So there is anxiety, but I want to come to you, Robbie, and ask, how are you guys using new AI tools to empower the next generation? And what would be your message to any young people or people trying to speak to young people about how they should communicate the opportunities as opposed to the deep existential fear?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, incredibly topical today. As you mentioned, it's the new uptick in technology shift that we've seen in the last 12 months or so. You're correct in saying that about 60% of jobs in future may be exposed to AI in one form or another, with half potentially being somewhat negatively impacted and the other half being really, really positively impacted as well. Ultimately, with the Notion, we see that AI is a way of helping us get more done in our day-to-day, either augmenting or supplementing your thinking. And it's reflected in the functionalities that we've built into Notion AI as well. And in our initial observation of our customers who've adopted our AI technology as well, we've seen that there's significant return on investment from increased productivity, allowing people to focus more on even more high impact and high value work as well. So we're net seeing a strong positive.
Sorry, explain how the tool works, just for someone who's not familiar with Notion AI, just to ground it a bit.
Yeah, so Notion AI kind of has two aspects to it. One is a generative AI component, where any of your basic documentation or tasks that you want, your RA functionality will effectively do that for you. So with a very simple interface within our product, you can ask AI to pull together an agenda, to brainstorm on ideas or topics that you were thinking through, to summarize some notes that you've taken within a meeting into something more succinct. And I think anybody who's leveraging AI products at the moment know that the real skill is becoming really good at prompting. On top of that as well, Notion has a Q&A functionality also, so questions and answers. If you can imagine the repository of information that you've built in your Notion implementation, through your notes, through your docs, through the wikis that you've created as well, leveraging Notion AI allows you fast access to all of that information. So the smarter you are about asking questions to your overall knowledge base that you've created in Notion, you're beginning to get back really smart answers, which saves you down so much time in searching through different repositories and silos for information. So in those two ways, we're seeing people be able to move faster and move a little bit smarter by taking on some of the lower impact work that they had to spend time creating, and having much faster access to the knowledge within their organization and being able to leverage that as well.
Yeah, and I guess there's, just remembering back to my early days of joining the workforce, or even any new company, there's always that kind of sort of information glut where there's so much to learn and it's hard to know where to find it. And hopefully AI will help with sort of onboarding the next generation of workers in a slightly more intuitive way via natural language. What about you guys, Siobhan and Figma? How are you finding this kind of adoption of quite a sort of impactful new technology at Figma?
Yeah, again, a very interesting topic all around. I think so. Firstly, just for anyone who's not aware, Figma is essentially a collaborative design platform, right, for teams to build products together. And the way we think, I suppose, philosophically about AI internally is, with AI, more and more people will become visual creators, and existing designers will be able to create more ambitious experiences. So if you think about, the total space of design is having a ceiling and a floor. The ceiling is how good you can be as a designer and at designing, and the floor is the minimum skill required to participate. And that goes for not just designers, but a whole plethora, I suppose, of different industries. And the way we think about AI is AI should be able to lift this ceiling and lower the floor, essentially. So, the threshold for entry should be lowered, and the what you can create should essentially be increased. And there's so much opportunity that we can kind of think about there. And across, a lot of our tools, there's so much that we've been working on behind the scenes on this. I think one of probably a functionality that I personally use the most is in our whiteboarding tool. It's a product called FigJam. So it's essentially, again, a whiteboarding space where you come to ideate. It can be across any department, but the AI functionality essentially helps you to instantly visualize ideas. It suggests best practices, automates kind of more tedious tasks. So even firsthand at a brainstorming session, you can see how it helps maintain or ensure that you're not just starting from a complete blank canvas. So yeah, that's probably how we think about it internally.
Yeah, interesting. I'll come to you, Paula, and I wanted to try and perhaps touch on another potential opportunity here for Gen Z. I remember well when I first went to work, I was very valuable because I was the only person who understood how to use Facebook. And now I have no idea how TikTok works. So I'm fully obsolete and put out to pasture. But I can imagine that, as we've touched on, digitally native Gen Z workers who might, just be kind of growing up with these new tools. They might have been using ChatGPT to write essays. What would you say, how would you advise companies on how they can kind of encourage Gen Z to almost be sort of the thought leaders in the company on the ways that AI can be implemented in a smart way? What do you think about
that? Yeah, absolutely. I think Gen Z is, I think the advantage of having a powerful Gen Z workforce in any company is that they don't need any upskilling. They just understand it. It's intuitive to them, and they are able to understand it just innately while interacting with it. So I think they're able to probably also think about what is obvious to them, and then observing what might not be as much to the rest of of the workforce and being able to inform what are the features that need to be adjusted so that we can all leverage them together, because I think there's no point in Gen Z only leveraging it. The whole point is that we all collaborate and leverage it. So I think absolutely, I think Gen Z should feel empowered to share how they're leveraging the tools with the rest of the organization, and then finding ways to scale those ways of working across the org.
Yeah, and I'll just come to you, Ashley, to let you have a bite of the AI apple in the interest of fairness. And I want to ask, actually, this is something that occurred to me watching Jeff Bezos recently did his first kind of long form podcast interview. And one bit that struck me that I've been trying to be mindful of is he mentioned how in meetings you should always ask the youngest or least experienced person to talk first, so that their sort of, their perspective doesn't get clouded by more senior perspectives in the room. And I just want to ask you how you fostered, like building off what Paula said, how did you foster an environment where young people feel like they can say their piece and make suggestions, and that no suggestion is a bad suggestion within reason?
Yeah, cool. It's a good question. I mean, there's so much already written on talking last, right? Everything that comes from being able to kind of avoid jumping in and kind of making certain decisions, particularly when you're in a position of responsibility, right? If you are talking, it's seen as a decision inherently if you are not very clear about it from that side of things. So it certainly took me a long time to foster not jumping in immediately when you feel like there is the right answer presented there anyway, because it's firstly completely biased, and secondly because you learn an awful lot if you can kind of be quiet for a little bit of time on that side of things. I think I guess the small attempt at the AI apple, I suppose. It's interesting that you kicked it off by saying that most people are worried that it would kind of be that lower rung of work, or that kind of, interaction based work that might be eaten up first by AI. And I would say that it's, to me, that feels counterintuitive, because certainly in a service-based industry like we are, that's every interaction that someone has with us, right? Like, I think for us to win the awards that we do is based on how people feel when they get in touch with us, when they have to, right? For the most part, if you're a supplier, they kind of want to leave you to it, and they want inherent trust in you to do it. But when people get in touch, they want to speak to someone who's understanding what they're doing, rather than being prompted with a bunch of things that might answer their questions. So we've been exploring using AI as a way to not replace the job, but to enhance the job. If there is X amount of minutes to be spent responding to a customer, okay, great. If AI can distill that, which it's really great at, taking those large amounts of text and giving us the essence of what the deal is, and crafting some sort of scaffold response, you spend most of your time actually trying to layer in that care and attention, that personalized touch that only a person can do, right? And from a technological perspective. And so for the same amount of response time, you end up really actually taking care of people. You introduce those random acts of kindness from those sorts of things. And that's how we've been looking at it, really, right? If you can analyze, okay, here's what's being said, here's the rough sentiment of what it is. You as the experts, you as the people that are communicating with people that understand these tools, that know how to best use them, use that as a way to prove what it can do, and prove what you can do as well. It feels very much for us on a service level like a collaborative effort, and not a replacement effort. And that will, I think, always be our approach to what AI can give us, but what people can give us as well.
Nice, yeah, an optimistic tone to strike, which is refreshing. So coming to an audience question again, this one's from Maria Epi. I'm going to throw this one your way, Robbie. It's potentially quite a thorny one, but she talks about that there's been a big push towards the idea of a 4-day working week, with the idea about giving personal time back and preventing burnout. Quite a divisive one, she acknowledges. So she says she's interested to hear the panel's opinion on what the pros and cons of a 4-day work week could be with Gen Z coming into the office. So yeah, I'll start with you. Do you think it's feasible? Do you think it could ever happen? Maybe with this increased productivity, perhaps it's coming. Where do you see it?
Well, it's a super fascinating topic, and one that I've only discussed socially with some peers in different organizations. Similar to what Siobhan was mentioning earlier on within Notion, we've come to a hybrid solution where we have some anchor days in the office, and then people will still work from home on other days. We try to create as good an atmosphere in our offices as we possibly can. We try to provide a lot of clarity around our mission and buy into our strategy. So we find that a lot of our employees, you know, when they can, they kind of want to be in the office, but we allow them flexibility to live and work the way they want to. Having managed different teams through scale up and startup periods, there's definitely something that I've observed that many workers will be able to get the work that they need to get done within the time period that they need to get done as well. And they don't necessarily need hard boundaries like a specific 4-day week. I've worked with you know, early career people who've all the time in the world and might struggle to get all the work done, that need a little bit of extra coaching and guidance. I've worked with some people who have so many different tasks and workloads they need to complete in time, and they're able to do it in a very succinct fashion. I've worked with parents who've got young children who need to, you know, time box the work that they need to get done, and they can get more work done than anybody. I've observed in the last little while. I definitely buy into and appreciate the concept of having boundaries, like a 3-day weekend, so to say. Although we haven't implemented any policies like that at the moment. So I'm very curious to see what spins out and what we learn, as a number of different organizations are investing more formally in putting more boundaries here in place for a 4-day week. And hey, if that comes through, I'd be all for it as well. I'd love nothing more than an extra day with my kids at the weekend, for sure.
Would be nice, wouldn't it? I want to come back to, you know, I think leading on from this, Siobhan, at the start, you talked about how you sort of shifted as a manager from that kind of presenteeism, as people call it, about just being present, to measuring output. Can you maybe just talk in a bit more detail on that, about, you know, what kind of approaches and strategies have helped you in terms of trying to shift that thinking, and how do you measure output?
Yeah, interesting topic, and it marries actually maybe with a question that was asked earlier about, you know, in a startup or early stage organization, how do you balance your time and how do you think about working over the weekend? And there's a couple of ways to approach it. You know, one is an individual employee, and another is thinking about it with your kind of manager or leadership hat on. As an employee, how I kind of think about that is something I'm always mindful of is, you know, how are you balancing and managing your energy? So, you know, there's not necessarily anything wrong if you want to work across the weekend. You know, we talk about that maybe in a way that's frowned upon when you think about work-life balance. But if that sincerely energizes you, and I've been in those positions as well, where I've been involved in startups, and you're just in that, maybe it's your stage of life or the work that you're doing where you just find it really energizing, and that's okay. And or you could be, you know, a different situation, which I'm certainly in now, where, you know, I have a 3-year-old toddler, I'm pregnant, my energy levels are slightly different, and so I'm mindful of my boundaries around that. And for me, weekends are very much off limits, actually. So yeah, that's one way I would think about it. And I'm in the camp that Robbie mentioned about kind of boxing off my time, and my family time is very important to me. If I flip to the other side then of thinking about it with my manager and leadership hat on, yeah, this is something that I've had to learn as a leader to kind of pivot into, is setting clear expectations, firstly for the organization, depending on roles, on what is the job to be done, what are some of the problems that we're looking to solve for, and when we think about outputs, what are they specifically? So starting there is really important for me, like setting those expectations for the organization. I frankly don't care when someone starts their workday or finishes their workday. I love that people have flexibility on how they do that, where they do that from, because I personally value that myself. Yeah, the outputs are really important. Obviously, if we're facing challenges there where, you know, we're not meeting output expectations, we need to start moving back up the chain a little bit and looking at, well, how are we thinking about input? So there is a bit of a balance there. But yeah, I would look at it through those two lenses of your own personal energy and how you're managing it as an employee, and then your leadership hat.
Yeah, nice. So we're coming to the end. I'm going to end with you, Paula, and we've gone into a lot of nitty-gritty details, but I just want to get you to, as our sort of Gen Z on the border representative, to, you know, beyond the details, what would you say to anyone watching this talk if they're wanting to attract the workforce? What are the big ideas? Maybe, like, you know, what are the big kind of values, or, you know, perspectives that Gen Z is bringing to the workforce that you think people should keep in mind, and maybe just limit it to 3 or something as we're coming to the end. But or less than 3 if you want. But yeah, tell what should be top of mind as people trying to attract the best talent of this next generation.
So I think the power of tools in both empowering Gen Z to lean into their strengths, their sense of immediacy, their want for collaboration, brainstorming, collaborative approaches, but that tools are actually also really effective to set healthy boundaries, and certain features enable both. I think one thing that Siobhan think described super well is just this: what relationship do we have to ourselves, and are we listening and being respectful of our boundaries, and leading with empathy, and I think within that, I think what we're seeing is respecting, like empowering people to lean into their independence and focusing on outputs versus how people wish to approach work. And the last thing, I think it ultimately always boils down to culture. And I think whether that's remote, hybrid, or in person, I think it's setting really clear values and leveraging the tools and aligning the team across that, and making sure that trickles down across the organization, whether you're a startup or a scale up.
Yeah, it's a great way to finish. Thank you, Paula. So we've come to the end. Thank you to everyone in the audience who's joined us today. Thank you to Notion for supporting the Sifted Talks. And thank you to all of the panelists for all of their insights. It's been such a good range of perspectives that we've had today. We're going to be back with our next Sifted Talks in March. So do go to sifted.eu.talks for more information on that as and when it comes up. And also, sorry if we didn't get to your questions today. We had a lot of really good ones. So thanks to everyone who participated. And I hope you got the answers that you might have found helpful. So thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.